Hi, everyone. We are going to give it a few minutes for everybody to get logged on, and then we'll get started. For those just joining, we're going to give it a couple minutes just to let everybody get logged on before we kick things off. All right, why don't we go ahead? There'll be a few more folks hopping on. There's still a couple more people joining. So as we're talking, but we'll go ahead and kick things off a little bit. My name is Carrie Carney, and I'm the Executive Director of 1000 Friends of Iowa. And we are a statewide nonprofit in Iowa that's focused on responsible land use, transportation, and the intersection of climate change. We've been co-hosting a series of webinars designed for cities and planners, really to take a look at sustainability options and transportation and land use options that they can look at, new and innovative. This is another one in the series. This webinar is going to be recorded, and we will send the recording out to everyone once this is done, as well as the slides that are used for this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Allison Van Pelt. Beth sent us a message and said she is running 10 minutes late. So Allison, my co-host here, is from the Des Moines area MPO, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thanks, Carrie. Yes, we all have to remember that Beth is in DC probably today, so dealing with a couple of different transportation options, but luckily she's just a couple minutes behind us, so we can take some time to just kind of reflect on why we're here. Like Carrie mentioned, you know, sustainability, transportation, none of these things are in a silo. And so 1000 Friends of Iowa, APA Iowa, and the MPO have been working together to make sure that we're putting forward best practices, bringing new ideas to the table, uncovering some of the answers that we all are looking for. And so this is a part of that series. When the infrastructure bill came out last November, there's obviously a lot of new different programs that are in there, and we all have questions about, you know, who gets the funding, how much funding, what are the qualifications and things like that. And as those things are being hashed out, we continue to inform our metro, but also folks like you all around the state to make sure that we're all moving forward together. And so today, once Beth does get here, we'll talk about the IIJA. But really, this was brought to us as a need. And we were asked by communities, hey, we want to get ready for these dollars. What can we do? And so I'd put a call out to all of you especially the folks here in Iowa, that if there are other needs, your community is asking questions about certain programs or new ideas or new areas of focus, please, by all means, reach out to myself. I'm the climate champion for the state of Iowa for APA. And we will do our best to either get you the resources, put something like this together, and really make sure that we're moving forward together, making sure everybody's informed about what's going on, especially as these things are new. We know the EV adoption and clean transportation is an up and coming field, that bell curve. We're still on the left side of the bell curve, but as we make our way there, what does it look like? And each community might be a little bit different. So we encourage you to reach out if there's a certain need you have. We also encourage you to look at past webinars we've done. We've talked about how to incorporate climate into your comprehensive plans, how to become an EV ready city and things like that. And we'll continue to do that. So this is really based on the pulse that you all give us. And so we always would take any feedback on what next steps you'd like to see from us and what other topics you'd like to see us cover. So I'll put my email in the chat once I get control of my screens and stuff back. But Beth, welcome. Thank you. Sorry you had to scramble last minute. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen real quick so you can start working on your end. But I'll go ahead and introduce Beth. So Beth is here with us. We're so excited. Beth Osborne is the Director of Transportation for America, a national nonprofit committed to a transportation system that connects people to jobs and essential services by all modes of travel, no matter their financial means or physical ability. She served as the acting assistant secretary to the US DOT and managed their Tiger Grant discretionary fund and the Secretary's Livability Initiative, and supported stronger fuel economy standards, National Freight Commission, and several safety initiatives. So we welcome Beth. Thank you, Beth, for being here, and let us know if you have any issues on technology.
Oh, I would just like to
I think
say,
we have it all working. Go on, I'm sorry.
I apologize, Beth. If people have questions, please use the question and answer feature, and then we can make sure that those are covered. Go ahead, Beth.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for being patient with me. I ran into some travel woes and I ended up getting back a little bit later than I expected, but I'm glad to be here and I'm glad to be able to support you all in figuring out the best ways to leverage federal funding to support clean transportation, which is the topic that I'm covering today. First off, I just want to make sure you know a little bit about the organization as it was described. It is a national nonprofit. It is also a membership organization for those that subscribe to our mission of creating a transportation system that moves people to the things they need, no matter how they travel, no matter how much money they have, and no matter what their physical abilities are. And we do that work through policy, research, development, and advocacy, through general research and reporting on what is working and what is not working in the transportation system, and also through direct technical assistance with those who are trying to get great things done at the local level. So first off, I'm sure most of you have seen this graph, which frankly, it's time to update because 2018 was a while ago now. But it basically showed that the transportation sector was the largest GHG emitter. It was a sector that was growing in terms of emissions, while others were starting to make some progress and shrinking. And it shows you also within greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, where is most of it coming from? I'm certainly one that is supportive, for example, of making the transit system more efficient, but you will notice here that it doesn't even get its own slice of the pie. So I think it's useful in terms of figuring out where we get the biggest bang for the buck is to recognize where the biggest culprits are. Another thing that I think is important is acknowledging that while we have gotten greater efficiencies out of vehicles, as people drive more, we have undercut that value. And again, it's not to say I'm not hugely, or we are not hugely supportive of cleaner vehicles. We think that that is absolutely essential to accomplishing our goals. So I don't know a more strong word than essential. But if someone has one, I please volunteer it, because whatever the strongest word is, that's the one we want to use. It's just unfortunately insufficient. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing all of our great ideas to the transportation system to accomplish a cleaner system. And one of the reasons we've seen the system undermine some of the benefits we've gotten from cleaner vehicles is we built a system that has forced every human in the country to spend more time traveling and going further to accomplish the same things they were accomplishing in the past. And that's just not efficient. And it's really expensive, not just from the transportation system perspective, but also from the perspective of the household transportation expenditures, which have gone up over the same period of time. And so we want to find ways for people to be able to accomplish all of their needs without having to put so much money and effort into travel. Also, in terms of the overall transportation system, we do want to remember that there's a lot of transportation impacts to the environment that are worth discussing. Vehicle emissions are big, and they are the tip of the iceberg. They're the things that we are the most likely to spot. But particularly when we're talking about emissions that impact public health, we see some pretty shocking impacts just from the pavement itself, which can emit health impacting emissions on hot days, which are going to increase. And we see huge damage from impervious surface runoff, heat island effect, loss of natural land and greenery. And then also, unfortunately, one of the things I can see us doing as a country, and I wish I couldn't see this as an outcome, is going into the transportation system and with a scalpel, taking out the GHG emissions while leaving all of the safety inequities and other problems of the system firmly in place. And what is a real opportunity is if we take on the challenge of allowing people to accomplish all of their needs while traveling less, while taking shorter trips, while sharing those trips, while being able to make those trips outside of any vehicle at all, we also will accomplish really great equity and safety goals as well. And wouldn't it be great if we could maybe take a broader approach while we're looking at making the system greener? So, one thing that is outside of transportation, but pretty much dictates whether or not our transportation investment works, is the way we're developing our communities. And I raise this because not acknowledging this gets us in trouble in two ways. It creates more problem. So, the beauty of the development on the left is you don't have to live close to that to save travel. You are more likely to be able to share a ride or take transit if all of the things you need are packed in together. And you can stop there and accomplish a whole bunch of different trips in one trip. But the development we see on the right-hand side is what is most familiar across the country. And this is a process where we take what are short trips as the crow flies, like between the house and the school, and make them long and make it hard to travel outside of a car. We make the car trips longer. We make it hard to share a trip because it's a single destination trip. There's nothing else close by. I like to say, rather sardonically, that this is the way you generate the most congestion with the fewest number of people. And that kind of inefficiency has huge environmental impacts, but it has huge cost impacts, and it has huge quality of life impacts too. And I think it's important in transportation that we don't, or maybe we stop trying to fix land use problems with transportation. We're making false promises to people because it's not causing the problem, nor will it produce a good solution, a lasting solution, or an effective solution. We also, if we look back at what's happened in the country, we did an analysis of the 100 largest urbanized areas between 1993 and 2017, mostly because that's where the data was most available. And we found that trying to build more just didn't fix congestion, but it sure contributed to a lot more travel and a lot more emissions. So we were building more freeway capacity than we were growing as a population, and it still resulted in congestion exploding, largely due to the fact that every single one of the people in that region was traveling farther. So we actually saw areas of the country, that weren't building as much as their population was growing, their congestion went up. Some were building significantly more, like in Omaha, Nebraska, capacity than their population growth, massive increase in traffic congestion. Then we found the places like Jackson and that had very modest increase in population and massive increase in congestion, or Buffalo, New York, that saw population decrease and a massive increase in congestion. Clearly, we are not tackling the problem, and therefore we're spending a lot of money and we're not finding the solution, but we are exacerbating a lot of those emissions problems. This is one of the problems. As we build more, we encourage people to shift their trips to more crowded times of day. Maybe they don't need to share the ride anymore. Maybe they try the corridor that was formerly congested. Maybe they shift modes. And then it just opens up, makes more land available and attractive for development. It can be easier to develop on the edge of town rather than to develop in the middle of town. And if you create more capacity, that becomes an even better sell. And you end up right where you started, with a lot more use and a lot more greenhouse gas emissions and NOx emissions that create public health problems. A lot of times in transportation, we're talking about emissions. We like to look at it as only a technological problem, or one separate from the other decisions we're making, but they're all bottled up. The land use decisions we make, where we invest in more capacity, all of these have impacts. And so if we don't take a broad look at what we're measuring, what we're prioritizing, what the impacts of our past investments are doing, we're not going to be able to get to targeted solutions, and particularly not be able to shift the needle in the short time frame we have available. So let's look at what's going on at the federal level. The federal government passed the IIJA. I just like to call it the infrastructure bill because I think we use too many acronyms in transportation and in general. And so if you're looking at where the infrastructure bill dollars are going, this gives you a good sense. I mean, first off, a lot of us in transportation forget how many really incredible non-transportation programs are being funded by it. And this gives us a chance to recognize that we're investing in broadband, and we're investing in better water infrastructure, replacing lead pipes, things like that. But transportation, surface transportation, is still the majority of the funding, and it breaks down like on the right. One thing I really want to point out is how huge that slice of the pie is for rail, which, comes out of nowhere. This is mostly guaranteed money. That is an incredible growth in a program. It's basically the size of the transit program that's been around for decades. And God bless the folks at Federal Railroad Administration that have to staff up and set up these huge programs in very little time. It is going to be a big challenge, but it's also a big opportunity. In terms of the Highway Trust Fund dollars, there are a lot of people really excited about the discretionary programs. I am very excited about the discretionary programs. And there are great opportunities there. And we're certainly available to help answer questions and help people position themselves to be competitive in those programs. But they are a very small portion of the pie. The big game is in the formula programs. And I think it's always important to keep the eye on the prize. You should not be encouraged to spend all of your time focusing on a tiny portion of that pie. You should be putting together your priorities and seeking ways to make all of the programs and all of the funding availability conform to your needs. We get ourselves in a lot of trouble when we conform our needs to the funding availability. Within the highway formula program, 75% of the program goes to two individual programs. One is the National Highway Performance Program, and one is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. Within the other 25% of the pie are things that we're very familiar with, like the Transportation Alternatives Program and the Highway Safety Improvement Program. You probably heard a good amount on the Carbon Reduction Program. First time we've had a program specifically focused on carbon reduction, but that carbon reduction program is 2% of this pie. And therefore, if you really want to change how your system works, if you put all of your focus on 2% of the funds, you're probably not going to get very far. So again, my biggest message is really think about that overall pot of funding and how every dime of it can be used to accomplish your objectives. If we stay focused only on the programs that have our names in them, then we're just not going to be able to make much of an impact. We need to see our priorities first, and then, like I said, make those funding pots conform to address those priorities. And those areas that really focus on things that way tend to be more successful. And this is my final attempt to make this point. If you are spending the vast portion of your funding to dig your hole deeper, it doesn't matter that you're taking 2% of the funding to refill that hole. You are working at cross purposes and you're going in the wrong direction. So, please, priorities first. This program is incredibly flexible, and we can be taking all that dirt, putting it in the hole and pulling ourselves out of it. We have created a portal that gives people a bunch of information about that flexibility. This program, the Federal Transportation Program, has very little direction and almost no accountability, but it has enormous flexibility that most people do not take much advantage of. And I really want to encourage folks to do that more. And so we provided some information to folks on how they can take advantage of it by just knowing which programs can fund things you care about. So I pulled out a list of programs that are eligible to fund active transportation projects. And this is not all of them, but it gives you a sense of how much of this program can go to build sidewalks and bike lanes and crossings and things like that. And I don't think people realize that, really almost every single program can be used for this purpose. It is 100% eligible. And on our website, we make available the actual citation that shows this, so that if you're talking with a public works agency or DOT and they're unaware of that eligibility, you can point them towards it. As my policy director, who used to work at a DOT, likes to remind us, if you're an engineer, you aren't following the changes in the federal code on a day-to-day basis. So you might not know that a program has been opened up to additional flexibility and use, and we can be good partners in showing folks that it is actually available and helping them to see where those flexibilities are. There are also some really exciting tools available to us these days. I'm often critical of technology only because technology is often seen as the solution when in fact it's a tool to reach our solutions. But there are more and more folks out there who are using those tools, those technological tools to change our direction and to make great impacts. One is the shift calculator that helps folks calculate how much induced demand there will be on a roadway or highway expansion. This is based on work done by the University of California at Davis, by Susan Handy and Jamie Volker. It's being utilized by Caltrans now in their own calculations, but they did it only for California. And so we worked with the Rocky Mountain Institute, with the University of Wisconsin, and with the NRDC to turn it into a nationwide calculator. And it uses the data we've been collecting as a country for the last, really 70 years, that shows that for every 1% we increase highway capacity, we see about a 1% increase in VMT. And we've seen that consistently across the country. We don't see quite the same impact from expansions in arterials, so that it's calculated differently depending on the facility you use. And you have to know how much of an expansion is occurring and which counties or, if you're from Louisiana like me, parishes, those expansions are taking place in order to calculate. But it's publicly available, and it's something you can utilize to make sure that as we are investing using, ever limited funding, no matter how much funding comes about, we always need more, to get the most lasting impact. And I strongly encourage folks to use those tools available. We've also been working with the University of Wisconsin to help get more multimodal data. So instead of just looking like we do mostly in transportation at how fast vehicles are moving to determine whether or not we are giving people better access to the things they need to get to, we're using the same GIS, traffic data, transit data that you rely on when you map out a trip on Google Maps or Apple Maps to determine how transportation investment impacts access. It's actually not even particularly fancy technology, and it's not new technology. GIS is 30 years old, and using traffic congestion data and transit data, these are not new technologies either. It's just putting it together in a different way than we already interact with it through our smartphones, to get a sense of how the transportation system moves people from different neighborhoods. You can look at where lower income populations are, BIPOC communities are, to make sure that the benefits of the system are being equitably distributed. Also using just GIS and geolocation data. And you can look at land use changes too. So you can come in and you can to this map, and you can expand a roadway or change a bus route or improve walkability, or move a grocery into a food desert, and get a sense of how it changes access to those services, and be able to figure out which investment is going to go the furthest, and which is going to go the furthest for particular maybe focus groups. Investing in wider roads might not help kids get to their neighborhood school any faster, for example. The last thing I'll say about it is this approach looks at the work trip very differently from all other trips, and there's a few reasons for that. One is people are willing to put a lot of time and effort into their commute trip, though the commute trip was only 20% of trips before COVID and is only fewer now. But it's the non-work trip that tends to dictate how many cars you have to own or how much you spend on transportation. So our whole transportation system and investment approach is based on getting people to work. And therefore, there's a lot more options available. But if you can't get to the grocery store or to your kid's school or to the bank and healthcare facilities, well, it doesn't matter about that commute. You're going to need to own a car. And so we find that it's access to the non-work trip that dictates how much people spend on transportation, how much they emit. It tends to be correlated with safety results, things like that. This is actually a much more important indicator than a trip than the work trip is. I will also point out there's some really exciting things going on at the state level in some places. Colorado just took the step that requires them to measure emissions from all of their projects, and then put in place mitigations to reduce those emissions. So if you can't mitigate against the emissions, you don't get to build the project. And they, in fact, just canceled a project because they couldn't mitigate the greenhouse gas impacts of that project. Right now, it's really unusual that people put such a focus on just measuring impacts in the first place. So this was a really, kind of groundbreaking approach, and they're only 6 months into it. So we're going to watch them and learn a lot. But this kind of experimentation is so important to the country as a whole. Thank heaven some folks are willing to go out ahead like this, and so that we can learn from what they're doing. So in terms of things that we can do, and let me just make clear, I know folks are particularly interested in funding for cities. This program is not focused on cities. It is focused on states. And the bipartisan agreement went very heavily into that status quo. So if cities want money, you have three choices. You can self-fund. You can stay gated off in the tiny handful of programs dedicated to cities, which will keep you in 5% of the program very effectively. Or you can recognize that that the overwhelming bulk of funding is going to the state, and you've got to play there. And that is extraordinarily important for you to understand. There has been no appetite at the federal level to refocus the program away from the states. So that's the bank. You want to rob the bank? That's the bank. So you're gonna have to play in that area if you really want to be able to get substantial access to funds. There are other places to go, but just recognize you are playing in you're in the kiddie pool. You're at the kiddie table at Thanksgiving. You're not, at the main table. So some specific actions to consider as you all are going forward is to really consider the impact of land use. And like I said earlier, be honest about when transportation investments can fix those problems and when it just can't. Sometimes some land use fixes can be almost almost free because it's on somebody else to build. It might require some incentives to get the kind of development you want, but if you're trying to fix a land use problem with a transportation project, you're really going in for limited impact. I think one of the reasons people lose faith with promises in transportation is we continue to misdiagnose where the problem is coming from. But there are ways now to get a sense of how there's an interaction between transportation and land use. We need to make safety a top priority for street design to encourage more short trips, both in and out of a car. But it also helps to develop or attract the kind of development that makes a big impact on, jobs and vibrancy and attractiveness of the area. And we're going to have to invest heavily in the non-car options. I mean, we did an interstate, multi-decade, hundreds of billions, if not at this point, over $1 trillion of investment to create a sophisticated roadway system. And we're not going to fully create alternatives by just spending a few $1 billion a year, on other options. So I think really shifting the focus, and again, recognizing that every one of the programs I pointed to have incredible flexibility. I'm going to go over all of these programs, the National Highway Performance Program, which is goes to the states, can be used for highways. It can be used for active transportation as long as it's on the national highway system, and most of your arterials are. It can be used for transit in that corridor. Same thing with the Surface Transportation Block Grant, though that can be utilized on or off the national highway system. You've got the Transportation Alternatives Program. We've got the new Carbon Reduction Program. We've got the Safe Streets for All program, which is very small in the grand scheme of things, but that is available specifically to cities. And then we've got things like the Reconnecting Communities program, which I haven't even put on this list, the RAISE program, and the MEGA program, which is for, RAISE is for little projects, comparatively speaking, and MEGA is for big projects, but they are all totally multimodal. They are available for any kind of investment in surface transportation that you're interested in. So, really recognizing the different ways to go about getting funding from each of those different buckets, all of which have their own approaches and decision-making processes, are important. And again, don't conform to the funding bucket. Have your priorities and push for them to conform to your priorities. It will make you more competitive in those competitive grant programs. Some more specific actions that we're looking and starting to see much more of is the actions that the Colorado DOT took. It's also really modeling and seeking to address the problems of now, rather than we have a tradition of trying to model what's going to happen over the entire useful life of a transportation asset, because it turns out that we aren't capable of modeling that very effectively. We literally we cannot determine what the world's going to look like in 20 years. We could not have foreseen what we've been through over the last few years back in 2019. So trying to solve the problems of 20 years from now, rather than addressing the problems of now, results in us overestimating what we have to build, trying to be on the safe side, and it creates problems, and it also can create underutilized facilities. So focus on the now, focus on improving existing infrastructure before we build new stuff. There's so much more efficiency we can get out of existing infrastructures. Defining the problem more accurately, like using multimodal access to jobs and necessities. And I will say there's some funding for the feds through the infrastructure bill to help people do this and to provide some tools to support that work locally so that you don't have to figure it out for yourself. Checking on past modeling and seeing where it was off, and seeking to do a better job of predicting how this funding will work out so we can better focus it. And looking at rules, procedures, standards, trainings, even staff performance review. What are we valuing? Are we making the low impact projects the easiest to do, or do they require lots of jumping through hoops in order to accomplish them? And spoiler alert, we make people jump through hoops to build less to build safer projects, less emitting projects, those projects that have less of an impact on the community, on the environment, on public health. They're hard to build because we use a rather one-size-fits-all approach to transportation based on the interstate system. And if we look up front to measure what we mean, in doing that, we have a better case to make when we go seek to get funding for that project. We have more general coalition support. These are all the things that make being competitive for dollars more effective. And if we can reduce the cost by reducing the size and the impact of the project, we can also get more done and be more competitive in seeking any federal dollars. So we did do a report called Driving Down Emissions that looks at all the different ways that we can reduce emissions, some of which require money, some of which require us to update our approaches to transportation and measure the right things. That is often less sexy, but more impactful. I'm the policy person, so I'm going to remind folks that focusing on policy will get us really far. but also focusing on the policy outcomes, measuring things well, and really thinking about the impact of our investments on everything that we care about, from the environment to neighborhoods to the economy. It creates a more compelling project, a more compelling set of priorities, and makes it easier to justify that project when seeking support, whether at the state, the MPO, or the federal level through competitive grant programs. So with that, I will stop sharing and am happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. We do have a few questions here in the chat. So the first one you kind of answered just a second ago was which programs are you referring to that that offer enormous flexibility? And you sort of answered that, but I'm wondering if
Well, let me answer it again. All of the surface transportation policy programs, every single one of them is extraordinarily flexible. The debate we have had over my entire career, I have sought, my organization has sought for more accountability and outcome focus. The bipartisan agreement has been around more flexibility. And the way we have come to agreements is we will give more money to states mostly with enormous flexibility, and then assume that that flexibility will be used to address local needs, whatever they might be, however diverse they are, to reach the outcomes. I would argue that that approach has failed miserably. But what drives me really nuts is how little of that flexibility is used. Almost all the programs can do almost anything you want them to do. And I'm happy to dig deeper. But the places that I've seen accomplish the greatest things, going back to Colorado for a second, Denver Union Station was done because they had a project and they made us at the DOT jump through hoops to make our programs work towards their priority. All of those programs had more flexibility than even we had dreamed of. That is the approach to take. So name your program that is part of the surface transportation program. It is more flexible than you think it is.
I'm wondering if you could give just a couple other examples about some of the other, like where you see some of the other flexibility, just like examples of things beyond Colorado.
Well, I mean, I think that the Denver Union Station was a great example. They actually used 11 different sources of funding to make that happen. And they forced us to put 2 different loan programs together for the first time. We'd never done that before. But almost every state has used flexibility when they wanted to. They discover the flexibility when it's a priority. They forget it when they don't want to do what you want them to do. So yeah, I mean, I've seen the state of Louisiana recently used National Highway Performance Program funding to work on Government Street in Baton Rouge to build basically a complete street. You know, I mean, there are tens of thousands of examples of this every year. It's not. I think locals take no for an answer way too fast. And so the reason we created our portal is we wanted to give you information so that when someone says, oh, you can't do that with that funding, you can go check. Because 9 times out of 10, that's not true. You can do what you want to do with that funding. What they meant is they don't like using that funding that way.
All right, thank you. Another question is the Highway Trust Fund separate from the infrastructure bill, or is it within the $432 billion for highways within the infrastructure bill?
It's so confusing, isn't it? All of this is confusing. Is this the reauthorization? Is it different from the reauthorization? The answer is the Highway Trust Fund is teeny tiny compared to this. Our Highway Trust Fund has been broke for 15 years. So we're still living in the 1990s where in our minds, the gas tax is bringing in ever more dollars. No, with this program, has never really paid for itself, and now really doesn't pay for itself. So, half of this is money beyond the highway trust fund. The trust fund is included within it, but we could never do anything this size because the highway trust fund, I think, is bringing in something like 30 billion a year. So it gives you a sense of how small that is compared to this big bucket of funding.
And then there's a question, what about funding towards electric school buses?
So there's a big electrification program in the infrastructure bill. Some of it is competitive, some of it is formula to states that can be utilized for all kinds of different electrification programs, but it can also be used for natural gas and propane. So for all of the bragging about how much of this money can go towards electrification, I just have to remind people that the actual deal that was struck includes some pretty heavily emitting options as well. So we'll have to see how the states and the federal government ends up spending their dollars. I think there's been a lot of focus on electrifying school buses. I do want to remind people about the pie I showed you. Electric school buses are a subset within transit that was too small to be its own slice of the pie. So while I think it's important to think about, just remember, how much of the pie we also need to focus on. And I just generally like to think about putting as much effort into that slice as its size. And a lot of times it can be easier to go after those fleets, even though they're small.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how do we know who in our state has already requested or received this grant money? And does the grant money have to be approved by the governor of the state?
Such a good question. It is not easy to know who's applying and who's not applying. And that can be really frustrating because obviously, certainly any federal program is going to have geographic distribution. And so to some extent, you're competing against your own folks. And that's not as productive as you might like. There is no database. What you can do is, in terms of federal competitive funds, they report all of their past awards. So you can go and see who in the region has received money. Just look up the program you're interested in. So if it's the RAISE program that was called the Tiger program when I was at DOT, you can go and see all the awards that have been made since the very beginning of the program back. I think the first awards were made when I was there in February of 2010, and get a sense of who has gotten funding, but who's going in this time, talking to people, word of mouth. Sometimes your city might know, a lot of times your city officials have heard, sometimes your DOT knows, and no, nothing competitive that's controlled by US DOT requires the governor to sign off. Clearly, the state has to sign off if they're going to use their own formula grant dollars, because that's their money and they make all the decisions there. And again, that's the big pot, that's the big bank. So don't ignore that. But that decision making process, requires you to. I'd actually go through your state legislature for help there. I think that they are an underutilized resource in seeking money, and having your legislator fighting on your behalf is very strong when they have to pass a budget for your state DOT. So worry about them less your governor. I will, however, say that when you have a project of some size, even if you don't need approval from your state DOT, it is often very, very helpful to have their support, both for matching funding, but also for running the project. There are substantial requirements associated with federal dollars and managing those projects. And it can be very helpful to have the state with you to help you comply with those rules and reporting requirements, and also to put a project out to bid. So just depending on what your local capacity is, partnering with your state that has so much experience in this can be really beneficial.
And I think some of what you just said fits with this question, but any suggestions for successfully gaining flexibility from the state? And they're asking specifically for Iowa.
Sure, sure. I would start by making the most compelling case for your vision possible. I think it's human nature to respond to negative stimuli, unfortunately. So focusing on the problem and the failure that you're trying to address with your project can be more powerful than just talking about the great things you can accomplish with your project. I wish that weren't the case, but I've never seen anyone change their behavior over best practice. I've seen them change because they don't like an outcome that they're seeing. So I would want to really focus on the problem you're trying to fix. I'd want to gain a lot of support, both with your local elected officials. Again, I would focus on that state legislature who, again, they have to vote on the budget for the DOT. So their opinion matters a lot. They're the funder. And so having their support can make a big difference as well, but also, other civic leaders and organizational leaders. And then once you get the state engaged in agreeing that this is an important project and they can't ignore it, then worry about the money. And one of the strategies I have seen to be effective is instead of telling them how to fund it, tell them to figure it out. Tell them you're willing to help them. But look, if they don't want to use the flexibility in the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, great, raise it any way you want. I don't care. Start to push, involve them in the problem solving. Then it's easier for them to see their own flexibilities, because if they don't see their flexibilities and they agree that the project is a priority, now they have to come up with money. That's harder. So I think it's just so important. Focus on the problem, develop your solution, develop your coalition, raise it as a priority, then make the money conform to that. And that seems to be the most effective way to go about it.
Great, thank you. Just a reminder, please put questions in the question and answer piece rather than the chat. So another question is, someone is specifically interested in what pieces of the infrastructure bill are specific funding for cities?
Very few. The priority of this of the federal government is not to fund cities. I'm shocked at the extent to which cities will put themselves out there to beg for funding for their states that then leave them out. But no one ever seems to learn. This is a state bill. The bipartisan agreement is to funnel money into states. And please know that. If you don't want that to be the case, stop fighting for them to get the money. In terms of what you can go to, there is, the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is about 3% of the funding, is competed out at the MPO level, the Metropolitan Planning Organization level, and at the state level. So that funding you can go directly for. There will be, there's something called suballocation, which means some of the Surface Transportation Block Grant funding, and actually some of the other programs now too, is supposed to be focused in on the regions, the cities. But sometimes that doesn't mean it goes to the city to spend. It's just has to be spent in that city. And then there are competitive grant programs that can be applied for directly by the city. The Safe Streets for All program, which is on the streets right now with a notice of funding opportunity, that is only for cities. That's going to be $6 billion over the 5 years, which has to be spread nationwide. And then the RAISE program, the MEGA program, the freight program called Infra, all of those programs can be applied directly by cities, but you are competing against every kind of public institution there is, including your state DOTs.
All right, thank you. Next question is, can you speak to the increased emphasis on equity and how that can be approached in developing funding applications?
So I don't know how much there's an increased discussion around equity. I don't know that, considering how little of the overall program has changed if I'd really consider it to be an emphasis. But a lot of it is wrapped up in how you measure the impact of your transportation system and how it is behaving now. So a lot of times when we look at safety numbers across a region, we can even out the inequities. But when you go in and look at where fatalities are occurring, where crashes are occurring, you start to see them. So your overall numbers might be going in the right direction, but maybe in certain areas they're not. And I think in terms of measuring that to define the problem and then explaining how your approach is going to even that out is the single most compelling way to address equity. Equity isn't a thing. Equity in safety is a thing. Equity in environment is a thing. Equity in economic development is a thing. Equity in access to jobs and essential services is a thing. So the outcome is what matters. A lot of folks will say we're spending this money in an area of our city that is low income or BIPOC populated, majority BIPOC or something like that. But some of the most damaging transportation projects of all time were placed in BIPOC communities. You know, in my hometown of New Orleans, the Claiborne Expressway divided a Black community in two. It's in the community, doesn't benefit that community. So its placement is not the importance. That's why you start with the problem, the outcome you're trying to adjust, and describing how your project does that. And that's going to really get at the impact it's going to have. That's going to be the best way to make your case and to focus on it. And I think the way to excite those who will be reviewing applications.
Next question is, where can I find the best, easy to understand documented website that explains all of these programs and opportunities under the new Infrastructure Act?
Well, I will brag on my own portal, which I just put in the chat. But I'll also say USDOT has done a really nice job of just letting people know in advance when their various competitive grant programs will be on the street. I think this is so important because, you know, they'll give you 60 or 90 days to put in your application. But a lot of times it takes more time than that to put your coalition together, to conceive of your project, to really think about what your priorities are. Then the application process is it's work on top of that. But you don't start, 60 days out from a due date figuring out what your priority is. So looking and getting a sense of, if we're going to do a Reconnecting Communities project, that is going to be on the street in August. So we need to start planning for it now so we're ready for it. And I think that can be very, very helpful. The other thing, I know this sounds super nerdy and boring, and I apologize for that, but it's really helpful, I swear, is signing up for all the notices of funding opportunity coming out of USDOT through the Federal Register. You can just go on the Federal Register website. They do a daily email. I get it for regs and stuff like that too. Don't recommend that. But for funding opportunity, you'll get an email that will say, Safe Streets for All, notice a funding opportunity. Boom, you were just amongst the first to find out that it's out there, and you have access to all the criteria and the deadlines and everything you need to know. So as a backstop, that's a really helpful thing.
And then there's another question about where someone could find a link to the past funding allocations for these programs.
Yes. Now, unfortunately, they don't do this like overall. They do it program by program. But I know, again, this sounds very, very simple. But you need only go into Google, put in the name of the program in USDOT, it will pop right up. So the RAISE program, I just did that while I was talking. And there's the link to all the RAISE information, including all past funding. They have a section called awarded projects. If you click on that, you can look at last year all awarded projects, and they have a map across the country where you can click on every single project they have funded since the beginning of the program, which was first authorized in 2000 or appropriated in 2009. You can do the same thing with, for example, the infra program. They have their own page for infra, and they will go and they'll also look at past grants there, and you can get lots of information from that. So you're going to have to go program by program, but that funding is always made public. It has to be in by law. So you can start to pull that down. Just follow the program. Now recognize the infrastructure law has a whole bunch of new programs in it. So we don't know about the awards yet because we're just getting into it. So probably this fall, we'll know about the first round of Safe Streets for All. And then that is so informative before you apply next year, because now you get a sense of what they're looking for, what gets them excited. And sometimes those who get awards will even make their application public. And so you can go read a winning application and get a sense of how you make that case in a way that is attractive to this crew making those decisions.
All right. And then let's see, I think we had one more question. So the Infrastructure Act had a lot to say about planning for the relationship between housing and transportation. Do you know where the DOT guidance or rulemaking might be headed based on Congress's additions?
Great question. I expect that, so that will be part of, they will do a rulemaking and a guidance process after these bills are passed. It's so much work within the DOT. It's really amazing. They then have to update the regulations around the implementation of all the old programs based on the changes in the law, and then set up regs for all the new programs. And guidance documents they don't require it to go out in the Federal Register. It's not as laborious, but that's a strong process too. And the guidance documents tend to dig even deeper into the implementation of the program than the regs do. So some of them are already out. Some of them are yet to come out. I don't think I've seen the final planning yet. But yeah, that will be available, I'd expect, this year. There's a lot of mays in the law, or shall considers, which means, like if you shall consider the relationship between housing and transportation, I just did. So there's not a lot of substance there. It'll be interesting to see exactly what they require, but they're not given a lot of authority to require much. There will probably be a lot of suggestions.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. What's the timeline for applying for and receiving grants?
It's a very good question. I will give you the straightforward answer and then the slightly more truthful, but not a straightforward answer. So Safe Streets for All came out in mid-May. I think the applications are due in 60 days. No, actually, I think they're longer. I think it's towards the end of the summer. Each program will give a different amount of time. The RAISE program tends to only give 60 to 90 days. They're trying to give longer application processes for those new programs so that people can get their arms around it. They tend to take 6 months or so to actually make funding determinations. With the new programs, that might take longer because not just federal highways, all of US DOT isn't really staffed to manage all of this competitive grant funding. So it's just going to take a while to figure out how to operate with so many new programs. So maybe this year it takes more like 9 months before those decisions get announced. We'll have to see how they are able to manage it all. And then the funding is available, but the way all federal programs work is it's reimbursable. So the grantee will spend the money and seek the money in reimbursement. Whatever's eligible can be utilized. All of this will require local match, which makes sense when you realize you have to outlay money first. So they don't give you a big chunk of money. This is not like a philanthropic award. This is the accountability built into the system so that Congress and the taxpayer are sure that every dollar is accounted for. I will say that just signing the grant agreement that determines what the timeline, the budget, and the eligible expenses are, that takes a while before you can really get to work on using that grant. It's easier for a planning grant than for something that's a capital grant where you're actually building something. But just keep in mind that once the award is made, there is a bunch of additional actions and hurdles that need to be dealt with before the money actually starts to be made available.
All right. Thank you so much, Beth. I think that that is the end of our questions, unless anybody has a last one on there. So thank you. This was great, really informative. Hopefully everyone found it helpful. As we mentioned before, this has been recorded. We'll send out the recording and all the links that were shared in the chat to everyone. And again, as Allison mentioned earlier, please make sure to send us your topics. Both Allison and my email addresses were in the chat, but again, we'll send that all out in a response email. Our next webinar that we have planned is going to be focused on developing sustainability programs for your community. Allison, did you have any other closing words?
No, thank you, Beth. Very informative. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate you.
And if anybody has follow-up questions or, needs some to be pointed in the right direction, feel free to email over to me. Me or someone on my staff can point you in the right direction.
All right, thank you so much. Like I said, we'll get everything sent out, all the different links that were shared and the recording. So thank you so much. We hope to see you all again at the next webinar. Thanks, Beth.